Early in the morning on May 23, 1934, a car sped down a country road, heading towards Sales, Louisiana, when gunmen suddenly opened fire. The driver, a 25-year-old man, was struck in the head, killing him instantly, and the woman beside him screamed. The men hiding in the bushes did not stop shooting. The car crashed into a ditch and almost rolled over. The gunmen ran themselves out of ammo, but only after both people in the car were, without a doubt, dead. But why? And what made this particular couple so dangerous? The gunmen were a crew led by a former Texas Ranger named Frank Hammer, and he had been chasing the couple for months. The infamous Bonnie and Clyde. Welcome to 10-Minute Murder, brief and bingeable true crime. I'm Joe, the host, and thank you for joining today. A quick update on the 10-Minute Murder merch shop. It's going great. I've received a few requests, though, to make red shirts. And the 10-Minute Murder logo is red, so obviously that won't show up on a red shirt, so I didn't bother with doing anything about that. But enough people have asked, so I will make a red shirt, but change the logo color to black. And then I'll also do one where I change the logo color to white, so you can choose whatever color you want. I do appreciate the other shirt requests I've gotten, but I probably won't be making any of those. Someone suggested a shirt saying, "The only thing I like to be brief and satisfying is my true crime podcast." That was one. Another person asked for a shirt that says, "I'm Joe the host." But what if your name isn't Joe? I feel like that's too individual. It would have to turn into one of those vacation keychain stands where you have like 150 of the most popular names available, and heaven forbid you have a unique spelling or unique name. Then you're SOL. Anyway, if you're interested in shirts and stuff like that, the merch link is in the episode notes of this episode, and I'll add those logo variations as ASAP as possible. If you're new to 10-Minute Murder, I hope you enjoy this episode and become a subscriber. If you're returning, welcome back, and I love you. Now, let's get to the story you came to hear. Bonnie Parker was only 23 at the time of her death, but she had lived a life that would make her a household name for decades to come. She was from a poor family, but her life would take a drastic turn when she was 19. At the time, she was married to a man who was serving a sentence for murder, and she was working as a part-time waitress to help make ends meet. But she wanted more from life than serving coffee to strangers. Bonnie wanted a more exciting life. She met a fast-talking thief from Dallas, Texas, who had that same passion for thrills as she did. Clyde Parker was a go-getter, ambitious, and the pair quickly hit it off. But then Clyde went and got himself arrested for burglary and was sent to prison. Now, this could have been a turning point for the couple. It certainly was an opportunity for Bonnie to pull herself out of the criminal world, but this trip to prison solidified the couple's commitment to each other and to their shared ambitions. Clyde was able to break out of prison with a gun that Bonnie had managed to smuggle into him inside the prison, and the couple went on the run. Clyde wasn't free for long, though. He was caught a few months later and sent back to finish his sentence. He was released in February 1932, and a few weeks later reunited with Bonnie. They were joined by two others, and the gang would begin a crime spree that would catapult their names into the limelight. At first, they stuck to their usual, burglary and armed robbery. But when a sheriff and a deputy came upon Clyde and another member of the gang drinking moonshine at a country dance, the two opened fire, killing the deputy and wounding the sheriff. This deputy was the first officer of the law to be killed by Clyde and his gang, but by the time they were caught, just 2 years later, they were responsible for 9 more, plus 4 civilians as well. After that first shooting, the gang went on the run, setting up camp in Jolin, Missouri, where they were joined by Clyde's brother, Buck Barrow, and his wife, Blanche. It was only supposed to be for a visit, but the couple ended up staying and becoming official members of the gang. And Blanche was not a fan of their new lifestyle. They all lived in one apartment that was over a garage. The group was loud, they drank heavily, and they played cards long into the night. On one of those nights, the police showed up outside the apartment. They were looking for suspected bootleggers. The Barrow brothers opened fire, killing one detective at the scene and fatally wounding another. Bonnie quickly got into the car with the others so they could make their escape, but they couldn't find Blanche inside the house. When the group found her eventually, she was actually running down the street chasing after her dog. They grabbed her and stuffed her in the back of the car, and no word on what happened to the dog. A roll of film left behind at their garage apartment would be what started to make the gang famous. Newspapers printed articles about the gang and printed the pictures that were found, like that infamous one of Bonnie posing while smoking a cigar with one of her guns, or the one with her pointing her shotgun at Clyde. This fame would come at a price, and life became more difficult for the gang. They had to be extra careful where they stayed and who they talked to. But things became even more difficult when their car fell off a bridge and Bonnie was seriously injured. Her right leg was covered in third-degree burns all the way from her hip down to her ankle, and it was burned so badly that the bone was visible in places and her muscles had contracted. The gang didn't think that she was going to make it, but they knew they had to find some way to help her, so they rented a cabin in Missouri. Blanche took the lead there, interacting with the property owner and buying their meals from him. But the gang quickly started gaining attention in all of the wrong ways. By the morning of the next day, they had covered their windows in newspapers to try to stop anyone from looking in, and Clyde and another member had gone into town to try to find Bonnie some supplies for her extra crispy leg. Nowadays, we would call it old-fashioned police work, but back then it was just called police work. They didn't have the benefit of cutting-edge science breakthroughs we have now, so the police were always looking for ways to stay one step ahead. Knowing about Bonnie's leg, they told local pharmacies to be on the lookout for anyone buying things like bandages and ointment for burns. And that's what tipped off the pharmacist when Clyde came into his store that day. It wasn't long before the police were on their way to the cabin, and this time they were properly armed, even bringing an armored car with them to try to make sure that the gang could not escape again. Another heavy gun battle ensued, and this time things would go differently for the gang. Buck Barrow was struck in the head with a bullet, fracturing his skull to the point he had an open wound and his brain was showing. And Blanche was almost blinded when she was hit in the face with glass shards. But the gang somehow managed to escape again and camped out in an abandoned amusement park near Dexter, Iowa. Buck was still alive at this point, even managing to talk and get something to eat. But things were not looking good for him. Clyde and another member actually dug a grave for him nearby, but they would never use it. Locals tipped off to the police and the gang was quickly surrounded again. This time, only Bonnie, Clyde, and their last member traveling with them at the time, Jones, would get away. Buck and Blanche were arrested. Blanche went to prison and Buck died 5 days later after surgery on his head wound. Bonnie and Clyde split up from Jones and he was arrested in Houston, Texas, where what he told them in his confession would lead to both Bonnie and Clyde being wanted for many more murders. All of this heat didn't force the couple to stay hidden, which would have been the smart thing to do. Instead, in January 1934, Bonnie and Clyde organized a breakout to free some of their former members from prison, and 2 more policemen were shot and killed in the process. This was the last straw for the police, and that's when retired Texas Ranger Frank Hammer was hired to track the gang down. Hammer was a tall, stern guy who was known for his firm beliefs in justice and what he thought was right. He was responsible for several captures and shootings of Texan criminals, during which he sustained over 17 injuries, and he still kept on going. He was like the Terminator. He began tracking the gang in February, camping out at his car, and somehow managing to be only a few towns away from them most of the time. But what he learned during this period would lead to their eventual capture. He realized that the gang traveled in a pretty set route, circling around and skirting the borders of 5 states so they could exploit the state line rule that prevented officers from chasing criminals into another's jurisdiction. And Clyde was sticking to a routine. The gang took it in turns to spend time with each other's families, and Hammer had figured out where they would be next. They were on their way to see one of the members that had recently broken out of prison, but the police were able to get to him first. His name was Henry Methvin, and he made a deal with the police to reduce his sentence by helping them capture Bonnie and Clyde. He parked his car on the side of the road just outside of town in the hopes that Bonnie and Clyde would stop when they saw him and the police would be able to arrest them. And everything seemed to be going to plan when Bonnie and Clyde's car appeared on that road early in the morning in May 1934. But at this point, the police were desperate and they wanted to make sure that Bonnie and Clyde would not be getting away this time. It's not clear if there was ever an order to open fire, but once that first shot was fired, there was no stopping any of them. When the smoke finally cleared, the police found Bonnie and Clyde dead in their car with several fatal wounds on both of their bodies. But that was not the end of the chaos. In some ways, it was only the beginning. When the police split up to call their superiors with the news, the scene was overrun by curious spectators. By the time reinforcements arrived, the crowd had already begun collecting souvenirs, and things took an even more gruesome turn. One lady was found cutting pieces of Bonnie's bloodied hair and clothing. A man was found trying to cut off Clyde's trigger finger, and another was trying to slice off his ear. The small town went from a population of around 2,000 to 12,000 in a matter of hours, with people arriving in any way that they could just to catch a glimpse of the infamous couple. Bonnie's body was taken by her family to be buried in her hometown, but her funeral was far from peaceful. Over 20,000 people attended the ceremony, and her family had to struggle just to make it to her gravesite. The same thing happened at Clyde's when he was placed beside his brother Marvin in Dallas, Texas, under a shared tombstone that fittingly read, "Gone but not forgotten." It was reportedly Bonnie's wish to be laid next to Clyde when she died, a wish that was ignored by her family during her burial, but her last surviving relative is still petitioning to have her reburied next to Clyde. Whether that happens or not, her name will be forever tied with his, both in the media and in history books for many more years to come. That's 10-Minute Murder for today. Brief and bingeable true crime. The story today was one that you've no doubt heard of, but if you've seen a dramatized movie, they tend to make stuff up to be more interesting and leave out the details that matter. So that's why I agreed to cover this one when it was submitted. And by the way, if you have a story idea that you would like to be talked about here on 10-Minute Murder, obviously there are no guarantees, and I do receive a pretty large number of them, but I do read all of them. I try to choose the most interesting ones and the ones that I feel like they can be covered in this format, this brief format. But you can connect with 10-Minute Murder on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. DM me the idea, and I'll take a look at it. If you enjoyed the episode today, I hope you'll consider subscribing if you haven't, and share the podcast with anyone that you think may like stories of true crime that are brief and bingeable like this one. Thanks for listening. Be safe and make good choices.